השם ויליאם דוידסון, בחינוך יהודי בבית המדרש הרבני באמריקה, בעל הקתדרה על שם תודור פלורנס ראום יותר כפרופסור לחינוך יהודי ב-JTS. תחומי המחקר שלו הם שבהם הוא עוסק עם הוראת טקסטים יהודיים קלאסיים, פיתוח מקצועי של מורים, פילוסופיה של החינוך היהודי. פרופסור הולטס שימש במשך 12 שנה כמנהל עמית של מרכז מלטון למחקר יהודי ב-JTS, כתב וערך ספרים, ואציין רק את הספר, אחד מספריו, הוא הספר הראשון בסדרה The Jewish Education Series, הספר הראשון שלו זה Textual Knowledge, Teaching the Bible in Theory and Practice. ובכן, אני באמת מזמין את פרופסור הולטס להרצות על הנושא Educational Translation, Content and Discontent, לכבוד בעל הספר השישי בסדרה הזו, שזה ספרו של פרופסור רוזנק. ההרצאה תהיה באנגלית. פרופסור הולטס, בבקשה.
It's my great good fortune to have had this visit to Israel that coincided with this wonderful event tonight, and I'm delighted to be here and to speak in English about this book that was published in English. Before I get to the topic at hand, I want to begin with a story in two parts, and the story is called How I Met Mike Rosenak. Here's part one. In 1977, I was a teacher in a Jewish high school outside Philadelphia, and I had decided for various personal and professional reasons that I would come to Israel and spend a year studying here. I already finished my doctorate, and I wanted to do a kind of self-invented postdoctorate in which I learned more about education and Jewish education, and so I decided to come and spend that 1977-78 academic year here. I had a lot of friends in America who were in the field of Jewish education, and I said, well, who should I meet that can give me guidance when I will spend my year in Israel? Who should I contact? And I got a list of about 12 names. One of those names was Mike Rosenak, and that name came to me from my dear teacher and friend, Joe Lukinski, Alav HaSholom. And I wrote 12 letters to 12 people saying, I'm coming to Israel, I would like to meet with you, I'd like some guidance, I'd like some help, I'd like some suggestions, and I got one letter back from Mike Rosenak. And that was my first introduction. Before I knew him, I already knew him, because it was about Derech Eretz. And now, I came to Israel that summer, and I went up I called Mike, and he invited me to meet him in his office on Mount Scopus. I remember it extremely clearly. And I guess I was a little nervous or whatever, so I came in, and I proceeded immediately on sitting down to mention all the people that I knew that I thought he might know, just to sort of establish my credentials. And he turned to me and he said the following things. This is stuck in my head since a very long time. He said, quote, now I know who you know, but I don't yet know who you are. And that was how I met Mike Rosenak. Of the many things we have learned from Mike's work, one of the most resonant for me has been his engagement with the question of educational translation. And this, Yonatan touched upon in his fashion, in a very lovely way in his presentation a few minutes ago. I'm going to look at it in a similar way and slightly different way as well. This notion of translation is a multifaceted concept, and in much of his writing, Mike has teased out the various nuances of this issue. At the very least, translation is, as he wrote in a previous book of his, Roads to the Palace, quote, an attempt by an expert to render a concept located in a mode of discourse that is incomprehensible to particular hearers into an idiom that makes sense to them. Incomprehensible to particular hearers, translation makes it sensible to those hearers. That definition of educational translation is helpful because it opens up the possibility of the wide range of uses of that term. At the simplest level, educators are always challenged by the problem of teaching very old texts to very young people. Educational translation is at heart a response to the distance between the learner and the subject matter being learned. It is about the attempt to bridge that gap. The gap in language and cultural references, for one thing, requires an act of what one might call simple translation. There's a famous moment in Hamlet when Hamlet is plotting the demise of Rosenak and Guildenstern, these two adversaries who have been sent to kill him, and he switches letters around so that in essence they get killed instead of Hamlet getting killed. And Hamlet says a line that has become a commonplace in the English language. He says, "For 'tis the sport to have the engineer hoist with his own petard." Hoist with his own petard. So a student studying Hamlet needs to know that a petard is a small bomb, that hoist means being lifted up in the air, and that an engineer is a military term and not the person that steers a train. So we translate and say to our students, that line in Hamlet means the bomb maker is blown up with his own bomb. In this very simple example, there is, as we say, very little lost in translation. I am now the third person to use that phrase. Because there is a very small gap between what Mike in this new book has called communicability on the one hand and authenticity on the other. But what happens when the gaps are a great deal larger? When the distance between the subject matter being learned, and the translation is a lot greater? My Shakespeare example before is essentially a case of distance and language. But the issue of language goes beyond the example that I've given and offers a chance to see the complexity of larger gaps than what I have mentioned. That is, the gap between the student and the subject matter. I would add that the tension between Mike's terms, communicability and authenticity, only tells part of the story. In the realm of language, the problem of translation can take us away not just from authenticity, but from the power and the reverberations of the language. And of course, a great deal of Jewish learning is about nuances of language. So, as an example, and a quick example of what I mean, here are 4 lines. I'm going to read to you 4 lines from one of the greatest poems in the English language. This is Shakespeare's Sonnet 73. This is the second stanza of the sonnet. I'll read it to you twice. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self, that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the twilight of such day, as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self, that seals up all in rest. In this quatrain, the speaker of the poem compares himself to the time of day after twilight. Note, this sentence that I have just spoken is already the beginning of translation. We might call this level 1 translation. It's kind of a fairly high level. I'll give you a counterexample, translation at what I might call level 2, low-level translation, for the stanza that I've just read. Here's another way of translating that stanza. I'm getting older, pretty much near the end, and pretty soon I'll be dead. Well, that's what that stanza is about. To say that in me you can see the last inklings of light, as in the moments after sunset, is to say that my life is nearly over. But the power is lost in that translation. All the echoes of association in those rather complex set of metaphors that, if we had time, we could unpack, all that is lost in that translation. I've taught this poem to high school students, and I've said, I'm getting older, pretty much near the end, pretty soon I'll be dead. I've said that. Chatati. If something is missing in the translation of language, how much more may it be missing in another arena in Jewish education, what you might call the educational translation of ritual? The gap between Mike's concept of communicability and authenticity, or what I was calling communicability and power, is made more complicated in the area of ritual, because ritual actions are by their very nature embodied. They are what we do, not what we think about. But to teach Jewish rituals in the classroom usually means moving from the embodied to the mental. That is, we take the incomprehensible, to use Mike's term, ritual actions, and we explain them. Here, the typical act of translation is in presenting students with the reasons for the ritual commandments. Ta'amei ha-mitzvot, we could say. Let us say that you have never shaken the lulav and etrog, and I want to teach you this ritual. What would I do? I would, of course, have to tell and show you how to perform the ritual. Which way you face, how to move these ritual objects in their proper order, when to shake, when not to shake. It's a little complicated because when you do it in Hallel, you do it, you shake a little and you don't shake a little. That's the how-to. But wouldn't the teacher need to fill in the explanations behind the entire enterprise? And of course, here we have many resources available to us. In rabbinic literature, the 4 species, the Arba Minim, are compared to parts of the body, different kinds of Jews, great biblical heroes, etc., etc. I'm sure there are many more that people here are familiar with. But does knowing that all the symbolism make any difference in the actual doing of the ritual? Does it make one want to perform the ritual? And in what ways does it or does it not help, to use Mike's term, communicate the ritual at all? Has that kind of translation actually moved us further away from induction into the ritual? As Yonatan said in Covenant and Community, Mike tells 2 stories about watching teachers educationally translate biblical language and concepts into a modern idiom. And he cited the story that Mike tells of the teacher thinking about Shaul and the verse, V'ruach Hashem Sara Me'im Shaul, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and the teacher says Saul is suffering from clinical depression. This explanation, Mike points out, is an act of educational translation, and, quote, a plausible manner of explaining the text and making it lucid. However, a girl in the class raises her hand and asks, but why do you call Saul's problem melancholy? The Bible says exactly what his problem was. God's Spirit had departed from him. What Mike explores with great subtlety throughout that chapter is the way language about God is problematized by acts of educational translation. And in the 2 episodes that Mike relates, the students, as he puts it, take issue with this modern rhetoric. They think or would like to believe that reading the Torah is an entrance to another world of meaning. This world of meaning, he writes, cannot be contained in the language of contemporary social science into which the teachers are translated. Covenant and Community is perhaps Mike's most obviously theological work, and I very much appreciate Yonatan's comments about these matters from earlier. Reading Covenant and Community, I am reminded of an experience I had 15 years ago while I was on sabbatical leave here in Jerusalem. I was spending the year at the Mandel Foundation, and I was doing some teaching for Melton, and mostly I was trying to write a book about teaching the Bible. That year I was sharing an office at the Mandel offices on Rehov Gretz. I was sharing an office with Professor Adam Gameron, who was also on sabbatical. And one day in the library at Mandel, I picked up a copy of Mike's book, Roads to the Palace, which had come out about a year or so before, and I was looking for something that I had read in the book when it first came out. I found what I was looking for, and then was taken up with rereading parts of the book for the next hour or so. And finally I looked up and said with great discouragement to Adam, who was sitting across the room, I said, I don't know why I am even bothering to try to write this book of mine. Anything really interesting about Jewish education has already been said by Mike Rosenak. Now this would be a much better story if I could remember what Adam said back to me. Because in the end I went back to my book and I eventually finished it. But the deep truth in that incident is that so much of the work, that so many of the people in this field, people sitting in this room, people not in this room, Johnny Cohen and myself in particular, but many others as well, so much of that work is a commentary on what Mike has taught us. Both the content of his work and a way of thinking we learned from him. It's hard for me to believe that when I wrote that letter to Mike in the winter of 1977, it was a few months before my 30th birthday. And here I am in the middle of my 60s. And what it means is that I have had Mike Rosenak be an influence on me for the entire length of my academic career. And I am so pleased to be a co-publisher of his book. It is truly a great privilege to have had so many years with Mike Rosenak as my teacher and as my friend. And we wish him many more opportunities to learn from him and to keep us on track as we undertake the challenges of our time today. Thank you.